The early years of the Purple Gang's appearance on the drug scene were a tumultuous era for many of the mob-like drug syndicates operating in New York City, including the ones operating in East Harlem. But within the gang's own ranks, internal strife and petty beefs led to several killings that law enforcement scrambled to solve. More often than not, they were added to the list of unsolved gangland homicides. This early violence was one catalyst that led to the mythos of the Purple Gang as something akin to an elite hit squad for hire in the underworld. There were a lot of blood-spattered, drug-related homicides. Everybody suspected them, the Purple Gang, of doing a bunch of them, but we couldn't prove it. The drug game was a violent one, and the gang was certainly amenable to dispatching business rivals with little to no provocation. A 1976 DEA report stated, much like the original Purple Gang that terrorized Detroit during the Prohibition era, the members of the current Purple Gang appear to have an enormous capacity for violence, involvement in numerous homicides, and a lack of respect for other members of organized crime.
Well, welcome all you wiretappers out there. That little snippet you heard was a little bit from Scott Dietche's new book about the Purple Gang of East Harlem, New York. I'll have links to get it, but welcome, Scott. It's really good to have you.
Yeah, great to be back. Good to see you again.
All right. Scott's been on here before. He did a show. We did a show about the New Jersey mobs and what was that? Gangland?
Garden State Gangland.
Garden State Gangland. So I'll have a link to find that down below, guys. Really good books. And Scott does his research. I'll tell you right now, he does his research. Scott also does famous for the Ybor City or Tampa area mob tour, which I took. And if you look on my YouTube channel, you can, I did a little 10-minute segment of what you would see. So if you're down in Tampa in the winter, particularly, I don't think you do it in the summer, do you, Scott?
No, we don't walk around. It's not conducive to walking outside during the day.
That's what I thought. But it's a fun tour. When you go to Florida next winter, or if you go, well, it'll be next winter now by the time this gets up. Go down there to Tampa and find the Ybor City Mafia tour and talk to Scott a little bit. Well, he'll give you a really good tour. So the East Harlem Purple Gang, that's that name for the original Purple Gang out of Detroit, which was famous for a lot of murders. And how did you get onto this story, Scott?
So actually, when I was doing the research for Garden State Gangland, I was looking into some murders in New Jersey in the 1970s, particularly the murder of Johnny Lardiere. And his nickname was Coca-Cola Lardiere. He was a Genovese gangster, and he was in prison, in state prison. He had a furlough for the weekend, and he was killed outside of a motel. And the ballistics on the gun used in his murder tied into other murders of quasi-Genovese associates and people that were scheduled to testify against Genovese members. And all these guns trace back to guns that were trafficked out of Florida by a group called the Purple Gang. And, I'd heard the name, obviously the Detroit Purple Gang, but I heard about the East Harlem Purple Gang a few times over the years, but never really dug much into them, and kind of got on a side tangent and started looking into it. I'm like, oh, this might be interesting as a subject of a book, because really a lot of mob stuff that was going on in the 70s in New York and to current day, to some extent, tied into this group. So that kind of initiated the interest in the topic.
Now, you know what I find interesting about it is it's like this small group of some Italian American, some Irish, kind of a mishmash, if you will, that's like organized, almost like a mafia family that operates in New York City together in an organized fashion, but outside the normal five families. Now, they had to be, people know what's going on. They had to kick up. Who were their main connections back to the Genovese family?
Yeah. So, like you said, it was kind of a mixed group that operated, but they all grew up in East Harlem. They all kind of grew up in the same neighborhoods. They were all kind of around the same age. And some of them had relatives, whether they were fathers, brothers, uncles, that were involved with the five families. But you're right, the Genovese, probably the biggest, the Bonanno family and the Lucchese. Those were the three that most of the guys in the Purple Gang that had connections tied to those three families.
Now, as they started exerting a little influence and power and got a little older and a little more organized, I assume they're like most young men gangs. They start with smash and grabs and burglaries and kind of higher end thefts, home invasion robberies, maybe. But then they got into the heroin trade, which was huge in New York by the 70s, as illustrated by the French Connection, that the tie-ins were really into. They were the people who were bringing heroin in from overseas before some of these other black gangsters rose up. So how did they get into that? They just fall into that, or act as enforcers or collectors?
So in the early 70s, there was a series of cases in and around this one stretch of road, Pleasant Avenue in East Harlem, which was a huge epicenter for the traffic of heroin, especially in the Northeast. And there was a big bust in the early 70s that netted, I think one netted over 70 guys involved in the heroin business. So a lot of the older cohort guys like Louis the Whale or Carmine Tremonti, who was the boss of the Lucchese family, they all got swept up in these raids, and it kind of leaves a power vacuum on the streets of East Harlem. So these young guys who are kind of, like you said, real kind of street level gangs, they kind of step up into this power vacuum and take over the heroin trade in the early 70s. So by the mid 70s, they've really come to kind of dominate that portion of that. There was a little bit of cocaine, but like you said, it was predominantly heroin that was their drug trade.
Now, were they able to take advantage of the really maybe 100-year-old trafficking routes from the Middle East to Sicily to France, like the French Connection? You know, first it went to Cuba to Trafficante, and then up to Kansas City and all up the Midwest and the Northeast. Later on to Montreal, the French Connection, where they were able to tap into that supply clear back to Sicily, I assume.
Yeah, so that was part of it. And also at this time in the early 70s, you see the emergence of the Southeast Asia route coming into the United States as well. So they had a couple different ways they were getting drugs, also through Canada. So, but yeah, some of those early routes, that kind of French Connection route, started getting a little bit too much attention from law enforcement. So, you know, as you would imagine, they looked for other alternatives, but they were able to plug in already to the existing kind of customer base and distribution networks that the older syndicate guys had before they were busted up.
Yeah, because a lot of them were, you know, as far as working it directly, were out of it during the 70s and 80s. They kind of backed off. So I guess these guys, like you say, filled that vacuum. And then as they had this working relationship with the La Cosa Nostra, then did they start using them a little bit like Murder Incorporated or something? They use them for different things. So you got a bunch of deadly young guys like this that kind of want your attention, want your respect, then you can use them for things. It's been my experience.
Yeah, and to some extent they did that. I'll give you an example. So just north of New York City is a county, Rockland County, and there was a Genovese, can't remember if he was a capo. I think it was a capo at that point, but a Genovese guy, Joe Pagano, and he was trying to run the carting industry up there. So there were a couple private garbage collectors, and in order to kind of push them out of the business, he hired guys from the Purple Gang and brought them up there, and they kind of, like you said, acted like muscle for him and were, you know, threatening to beat up carters and threatening the life of these guys that own these other private carting companies. So yeah, in exactly the way you described, they were kind of brought in as these young guys who were pretty violent, hot-headed, and let them do all the dirt work.
Now, these you mentioned the guns out of Florida. Were these 22 caliber guns? And you know, Chicago had the same kind of a deal going. They were bringing, especially some 22 calibers up out of Florida. Was this the same thing? You know any more? You're learning more about that kind of ability to get the weapons and spread them throughout New York?
Yeah, so they were going down predominantly 22s. They were going down to gun dealerships in Broward County. For those not familiar, that's Fort Lauderdale, just north of Miami-Dade County, and purchasing all these guns and just literally just driving them up I-95 back up into New York and distributing them amongst the Genovese family. And the main guys that were doing this were Purple Gang members like Frank Facerdo Jr. and Richard Rocco. So there was that connection there. Now, one of the interesting things is, like you said, there was a spate of 22 caliber killings in the 70s because all these guns that were being brought up there in Chicago, was an area where they were being brought up. In fact, Sam Giancana was killed with a 22. His murders thrown up there in this kind of rash of 22 caliber murders.
Yeah, even out to Las Vegas too, because of the Chicago influence. That I think Frank Culata used one of those 22s, and Ken Ito was a famous Chicago hit. And they were reloading the bullets with less powder so it would make less noise and put silencers on them. And then the bullets weren't as strong.
Oh, yeah.
That's what they did in Chicago. So they didn't get Ken Ito killed, and that hurt them big time. Didn't sound like your New York guys tried to mess with the bullets up there. It sounds like that their 22s always worked the way they were supposed to.
Yeah, they definitely seemed that way. There were a lot of, just kind of on an aside, one of the things that I found from doing this research is I never realized how violent the mafia in New York were in the 70s, how many killings, just even outside the Purple Gang. It was a really violent era, especially in the mid 70s for the mafia.
I think it was a time the same way in Kansas City, Cleveland, the Danny Green thing. It's like the 70s was a time when the post-war baby boom young guys started coming of age, and they're wanting some more action, and the old guys who were like the Mustache Pete's going back to the 20s were still wanting to hang on to what they had. So, speaking of the older guys, now East Harlem, wasn't that Fat Tony Salerno's kind of area of operation, shall we say? Did he have a special connection with these guys, or did he come into play on this?
There were some connections. Actually, funny enough, there were two. There was a Tony Salerno and a Frank Salerno who were tied in with the Purple Gang, no relation to Fat Tony Salerno. But yeah, so, East Harlem, going all the way back to the foundation of the American Mafia, you had guys like, Clutch Hand Morello. He was based out of East Harlem, Ciro Terranova. Joe Valachi grew up in East Harlem. So East Harlem is a real fertile ground for mafia guys. And around the time the Purple Gang come up, there's still a lot of mafia guys. And like you said, just a couple blocks over, Fat Tony Salerno had his Palma Boys Social Club, which was his headquarters. So yeah, I think because of that proximity and that already some strong ties with the Genovese family, that was one of those connections that they had.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed that in Kansas City, like anywhere around the city market here, if you had a bar or something, then the mob, the Sabella family felt like that they had some kind of proprietary interest just because of geography, because it was in their kind of historical area. So, I mean, that's the mob. They think they own you if you come within their purview, or they do anything for you in any way. They own you the rest of your life. That's the mob, boy. And these guys, they were like, I guess they were like La Cosa Nostra wannabes. Did they see themselves as a farm team for the La Cosa Nostra?
Yeah, that's kind of a good descriptor, because what ends up happening is, the Purple Gang really lasts maybe 10 years as this kind of real viable group. By the late 70s, early 80s, some of these guys start getting plucked into the majors, if you will, kind of brought in and made into some of the mafia families. So the group starts kind of dissipating. Some guys go into the Genovese family, Bonanno family, and the gang kind of, there's still remnants of it, but by the mid to late 80s kind of disappears and becomes kind of more mythological thing than actually a viable gang. But all the guys that were involved in it that were still around are still active in various aspects of organized crime, whether still in the drug trade or in other areas.
Now, those connections, this may be a little bit too much detail and stuff that's really hard to learn. They had connections with the Black community. Did they have like a point person that you could find out that then, took the larger loads that they were able to get in from overseas and then started distributing more onto a street level? Because they didn't go out into the streets of Harlem and sell drugs on the street corner.
Yeah, so there were a lot of close connections between the Black dealers at the time and the Purple Gang. Frank Vicerdo Jr. had used some dealers in Harlem to move his product. Probably the best known one is Matthew Madonna, was the major drug supplier to Nicky Barnes. And,
Okay.
Nicky Barnes, obviously very well-known Harlem drug dealer back in the day. And Matthew Madonna was a member of the Purple Gang, who later became kind of the acting boss of Lou Casey's when he was released from prison in the 90s. But so there's a relationship there where they start off as suppliers, and then over time, some of the black gangs go off on their own, become their own self-sufficient operation, and don't need the mafia to supply them anymore. So, but definitely in the early years, there were a lot of close ties.
So those old blaxploitation movies, as we used to call them, like Superfly, where they always showed the evil, the corrupt policeman, the evil, usually Italian-sounding white guy, and then the black dealer. So that's all based in fact, then, isn't it?
Yeah. I think to some extent, yeah, especially back in the early 70s, for sure.
Yeah, because the New York City Police Department, Special Investigations Division, the narcotics people, they were, there was some shady business going on back in those days.
Yeah. This is the time of the Knapp Commission. Frank Serpico and his testimony in the resulting movie with Al Pacino, just kind of really showing how embedded the mafia were in police corruption, and especially in certain neighborhoods where they were paying off everybody.
I'm trying to think that Pleasant Avenue. What else was Joey Gallo and his crew?
That's President Street.
That's President Street. Yeah. Okay, I'm getting my P streets mixed up here.
There's actually there's a great collectible mafia book. You can't find a copy for under a couple $100 called The Pleasant Avenue Connection, from the early 70s. And it's one of the cops that worked on that original case that busted a lot of the main heroin dealers at the time. So if you might be able to find in your local library, it's really an interesting book. It's kind of a nice snapshot of like the early 70s, and the mafia drug gang. And, one of the other things I think through my research, and this because we've talked about this before with the Kansas City Tampa connection, is this eternal myth that the mafia were never involved in drugs. And I don't think anything could be further from the truth. They were deep in it for a long time.
Yeah, way too much money. And the families you mentioned that they were connected to are the families of Bonanno, Genovese, and Lucchese. Those are the families that then had, and they just didn't add Gambino in it, but they all, were well known, as come out. And, as we look back in history, that they all were making money off the heroin and then the cocaine, and probably still do to some extent, greater or lesser today, because there's just too much money in it, just way too much money in it. It's too corrupting an influence. It's amazing. So these guys, as they, kind of matured and got older, how did that progress in their relationship with as they wanted to go into the crime the La Cosa Nostra families? And they didn't really become the sixth family, although I read somewhere where there were some people that claimed that they might be the sixth family. They never really quite got to there. How did that develop as they got older?
Yeah, so there was a period of time like 77, 78. There was a bunch of news articles written about the Purple Gang. It was like the flavor of the month, if you will. Yeah. They called them, the sixth family, that they were getting ready to take on all the other five families. And that's a little kind of media hyperbola. But in reality, what was happening is that the guys that already had family connections now were getting, in their mid to late 20s, had shown their ability to make money on the street, are now being pulled into the family. So guys like Angelo Prisco, who becomes a Genovese family member, Mikey Mancuso, who goes into the Bonannos and now is currently allegedly the head of the Bonanno crime family here in 2023. He's a Purple Gang member. Other guys like Danny Leo, who was a Genovese acting boss for a while. These guys start making that move up into the big leagues. But then you also have guys like the Meldish brothers, Michael and Joseph, who can never be made because they're not Italian. They kind of keep on the more street level criminal activities, but still have ties to the different families. So as they mature, as they get older, they really kind of become absorbed into the overall organized crime picture of New York.
Wow, it's it's quite a little slice of life in New York City that you've stumbled onto that's not has not really been reported on or books written about particularly. I first saw you talking about it, or I saw your book or something. I thought, well, who is that? I did my own little bit of research, did kind of quick little overview recently, and threw it up on my podcast just to like instruct myself in it because I knew I was going to be talking to you, and it's a really interesting little kind of a hidden little pocket of organized crime in New York City that most people didn't know about. And there needs to be a movie made, I think, about these guys. It's got all the right stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially in the early years, like the first couple years, like 72, 73, 74, you see a lot of killings internally. Like there's a lot of drug beefs between guys in the gang, and there's quite a bit of violence. I was fortunate enough to get a copy of a DEA report, which I referenced in a little snippet I read. And it really kind of started outlining all these murders that not only were they responsible for, but other ones they were allegedly involved with or tied to. And then as the 70s go on, their name pops up in other killings, like these Genovese family killings in the late 70s, tying into a New Jersey mobster by the name of John DiGilio. And then one of the weirdest killings that the Purple Gang is tied to is the killing of Donald Arano in Miami, Florida in the mid-1980s. He was the founder of Donzi, Apache, made other cigarette boats. Yeah. And he got wrapped up in that South Florida drug era thing. But what was interesting is he was also very good friends with Frank Vicerdo Jr. and Paul Cayano, guys that were members of the Purple Gang. So after his murder, the Purple Gang kind of come under law enforcement radar. And the gentleman that's ultimately charged and convicted of his murder is likely tied into a drug syndicate run by this guy named Ben Kramer. So not a direct tie to the Purple Gang, but still the fact that they're, around all these kind of more high profile killings was interesting.
Yeah, I always wanted to do that story on that Daniel Arano. Thunderbolts or something like that was the name of his company. Or anyhow, I always wanted to do that. I just never got back around to it. I read all up on it one time and then got distracted. But it's a heck of a story.
Oh yeah,
in
absolutely.
Itself. That guy's like, Mr. Upstanding businessman, but yet he's got all these connections with the drug gangs and ends up being a victim of assassination. Really.
Yeah, and he was tied in with George Bush, the elder George H.W. Right. Bush, and he was actually making so in a nutshell, the thing was he was making boats for customs agents to intercept drug dealers, but his other boats were being bought by drug dealers. So
I know it's a heck of a story. Get into that one. All right. Is there any other particular stories that you want people, giving people a little taste out of your book here?
Yeah, I think another interesting thing is and it was really apparent with the gang. So they all kind of grow up in East Harlem, which is this tight knit, but real urban, dense neighborhood on the upper East Side of Manhattan. Small neighborhood, which at its height was actually a much bigger Little Italy than the famous Little Italy on Mulberry Street. But they kind of follow that pattern that a lot of mobsters do. So even though their early exploits are centered in East Harlem, by the late 70s, they're going suburban. So they're moving up to Yonkers and to Tuckahoe and these kind of outside the city neighborhoods, and their crimes are following them. So now you start seeing news articles from these more kind of suburban, even quasi-rural police departments. Suddenly there's mafia guys moving into their town. And so it's kind of interesting because it follows that pattern that you see with the mafia in New York as they kind of got more successful. They move out to Long Island. They move, out into the suburbs.
Yeah. Same here in Kansas City. Exactly the same. Yeah. I guess it's the same all over. Interesting. Did you run on to, especially early, any stories about them doing a lot of rip-offs of other drug dealers? They'd pick tips up because you're in that world. You pick tips up about other successful drug dealers and learn where their stash house was, or maybe where they kept their money or things like that, and then go do a home invasion kind of robbery. We get those all the time, and you can always tell in the newspapers two people found dead in a house, and I can tell you right now, it's a drug robbery. So did they get into any of that?
So yeah, so there are some stories and some like rumors around that they did exactly that. They were kidnapping other drug dealers. They were kidnapping low-level wise guy associates and basically kidnapping ransom type scheme, exactly as you described it. And they're also implicated in a couple bigger, the disappearance of Ettore Zappi, who was a Gambino guy in Florida. Supposedly there's a purple gang connection to that. But certainly in those early years when they're out and about, there's definitely some kidnapping. I didn't see a lot in terms of like robbery or home invasion type stuff, but the kidnapping for ransom definitely was one of the things they were involved in.
Interesting. That's how all these young mob guys start, is ripping off other criminals because they want to have the balls to do it, if you will, where other people don't really have the cojones to do something like that. It's interesting progress. I've seen it here in Kansas City, and it's, we even had one FBI set up a drug sting, and these guys found out about it, and they're the ones that looked like the FBI was going to sting them. They didn't know how bad these guys were, and they went in, and Bureau had the hotel room wired up for camera and sound. And the guy just pulls out a gun, starts shooting the guy the informant that's going to sell him these 4 or 5 kilos of dope. And then they arrested the getaway driver out in front. And I know from intelligence sources that they were part of a gang that was getting into that. And that's how they were getting started, was doing kidnappings and ripping off other people for
that's
drugs.
Crazy.
All right. Scott Dietche from Tampa, Florida, York City Mafia tour. And the Purple Gang, remind us the title of that and your other titles too. You've got several other titles. I didn't write them down. I know you've got them off the top of your head, and I'll put links to all this down below, guys.
Yeah, so the book is called Hitmen, the Mafia, Drugs, and the East Harlem Purple Gang. Also wrote Garden State Gangland, which is kind of the first overall comprehensive history of the Mafia in New Jersey. And Cigar City Mafia, which is a story of the Tampa Mafia.
All right, great, Scott. I really appreciate you coming.
Yeah, anytime. It was great being on again.
It's good to see you again. Well, guys, don't forget, I like to ride motorcycles, so watch out for motorcycles when you're out there on the street. And if you have a problem with PTSD and you've been in the service, go to the VA website and get that hotline. If you have a problem with drugs or alcohol, our good friend Anthony Ruggiano, who was on the show not too long ago, has a hotline on his website. I think it's reformedgangsters.com or anthonyruggiano.com. And he also has a YouTube page, and he also works in treatment down in Florida somewhere. So call that hotline and maybe you can get in treatment with Anthony Ruggiano. And so thanks a lot, Scott, for coming on the show.
And real quick, I interviewed Anthony for the Purple Gang book. He had some good stories with that. So tying that all in. Yeah.
Great. Thanks a lot, guys. Thanks a lot, guys. Thanks a lot, guys. Thanks a lot.